Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It was on the FBI's vision board for the past 10 years, and finally, after countless operations and victims, former Canadian Olympian Ryan Wedding is now in custody. Now, the catch is this man, who's been on the run for about a decade on drug trafficking and murder charges, was the one who turned himself into the U.S. Embassy in Mexico last Thursday night. A detail that would likely have investigators completely dumbfounded given the gravity of the case. FBI Director Kash Patel, though, seemed to not play into it too much, nor give much detail.
Without getting into operational sensitivities, Ryan Wedding was apprehended last night in Mexico City. And to safeguard the integrity of the ongoing investigation, we will not go into that. But I think it goes without saying, to go down to Mexico, to find a guy who's been on...
And not to mention the video footage of Wedding coming out of the plane last Friday, towering over the dozen of law enforcement personnel around him. So what comes next for the 44-year-old who is compared to that of El Chapo or Pablo Escobar? Could this self-surrender be a sign of potential investigative cooperation? An update we might be seeing as early as today with his arraignment in California. And what will the U.S.-Canada law enforcement collaboration even look like in one of the most sensitive times in our relationship with our neighbors down south? I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Calvi Leon, a crime reporter for the Toronto Star who's been covering this case for years, including all the twists and turns. She joined us a few months ago on The Big Story to break down the details up until that point, and we are so excited to have her back on to bring us up to date and unravel the latest bits and pieces of this moving story. Calvi, thank you so much for being back here on The Big Story.
Thank you for having me.
You know, quite the development we'll be discussing today since the last time you were on The Big Story. Ryan Wedding was on the run for about a decade. He was wanted for drug trafficking charges and murder charges and for other crimes he was allegedly tied to. And just last week, he's been arrested and now in the custody of the FBI. I mean, can you bring us up to speed a bit here? How did this man from Thunder Bay, who is an Olympic snowboarder for Canada, become one of the most notorious drug lords to date?
Yeah, that is the question. How did he go from snowboarder, Olympian, competing for Canada to an alleged drug kingpin? So we can sort of trace this back to a couple years after his Olympic debut. So in 2006, Ryan Wedding was named on an RCMP search warrant for a large-scale marijuana grow-up. So we get a bit of an idea as to what he might have been up to around this time. That said, there were no charges laid in this search that the RCMP had executed on this property. They had seized about $10 million worth of cannabis plants. But in the end, there was nothing that really came from that in court. And so if we fast forward to just a couple years later, we actually hear about the first time that Wedding was involved in drug trafficking. So he was arrested after flying from Vancouver to California and trying to purchase 24 kilograms of cocaine to then bring back to Canada and sell at a higher price. And so him and a few associates that he was with were making this buy. And during the transaction, shortly after, authorities were monitoring Wedding and the associates that he was with. It was sort of an undercover sting. They were working with an informant who actually was a former KGB agent, which is sort of an interesting side note. And so they had their eyes on Wedding and his associates, and they were able to arrest them during this cocaine buy. And shortly after that, Wedding had been in custody. A couple years later, he's convicted, and he serves ultimately around 4 years in U.S. and a few different U.S. prisons. So it's during this time when Wedding is in U.S. custody that he could have easily been creating these connections in the drug trafficking world. And so he gets out of prison around 2011 and he's deported back to Canada. And we know that around this time, he's actually now living in Montreal, allegedly creating more connections with organized crime members in and around the Montreal area. And also shortly after, a couple years in 2015, then being watched by the RCMP. So Wedding in 2015 was named in a massive drug trafficking investigation that the RCMP was leading called Operation Harrington. And so several Canadians were charged. This was an investigation looking at how cocaine was getting from Colombia, Mexico, into Canada, working with cartel members. And so this is the first time we actually get a sense of, when Wedding is making these connections with people directly associated with the cartels. The Sinaloa cartel is mentioned during this investigation, and some names that are tied directly to leaders within the cartels. And so in 2015, when the RCMP show up to arrest Wedding, he is actually already gone at this point. And so it's believed that he has been hiding in Mexico for the last decade, ever since. And this past week, was sort of the culmination of that. It was the culmination of a complex, years-long investigation led by the FBI, but it was also sort of the outcome of a probe that had been underway here in Canada as well. And so this was spanning multiple countries. It was a massive manhunt. Several different law enforcement agencies were involved, including the RCMP, as we heard. And, Wedding, we heard that he surrendered himself in on Thursday night, and he was brought into U.S. custody on Friday morning.
The details are just so fascinating. I really want to get into how he got arrested. Some reports saying he turned himself into the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. Others are saying he didn't, and that it was a high-stakes operation that led to his arrest. I mean, can you take us through the details of the arrest last week?
Yeah, so we heard from the U.S. Embassy, and we heard from a top Mexican government official saying that Wedding turned himself in, that he surrendered. And then, we hear at the press conference from the FBI director, Kash Patel, saying Wedding was arrested, that this was a high stakes, 0% chance for error operation. And that, they had the hostage team, the aviation team, the special forces, several different units that were involved. And so we sort of get conflicting reports. So it seems at first, but really these two things can be true at the same time. I mean, when Patel was asked to elaborate more on the arrest and how it actually went down, he declined to comment, citing the sensitive operation and the investigation that continues to move forward. But I think people are sort of getting stuck on this idea that, Wedding surrendered himself. He just walked right into the U.S. Embassy saying, "Hey, I'm here, take me." I think two things can be true at once, right? So he could have been surrounded, they could have had eyes on him, and he could have come out and just not resisted, and that could be him surrendering himself. We don't actually know what that looked like, but we do know that you have officials confirming that he did surrender, and so it sounds like to some level there was an element of cooperation there, that he wasn't resisting this arrest, whatever that looked like.
I just think that's so fascinating, considering this man was, did everything in his power to be invisible to law enforcement. And then, I mean, there could be so many reasons as to why perhaps he went to the embassy to turn himself in, or, that he was working with law enforcement. But, as someone that's been covering this story, why do you think he did?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to speculate, but speaking to sources, to people who have been observing the case for a long time, a couple of people I interviewed for the story about his arrest, it's interesting to hear their thoughts. One of the things that they raised was perhaps this is a indication, a sign that he's willing to cooperate with authorities. Maybe he's looking to get a lesser sentence. I mean, he is facing the prospect of life in a U.S. prison. So that remains to be seen how that plays out and if that happens. But it's definitely, something to consider. Will he cooperate? Will he be able to provide intelligence information to authorities on, say, other cartel members, other people who are associated with the cartel? It's definitely a possibility. And so we'll have to see if we learn of that moving forward. It might not come out until trial or after. We might not ever really know, but it's definitely something that could happen.
Right. Just speaking about the announcement of the arrest in itself, with FBI officials and Kash Patel, I mean, the politics of that moment was definitely present. Kash Patel mentioning repeatedly U.S. President Trump and how grateful he was that he, backs police and backs the men in blue. I mean, why do you think this moment was a chance that Kash Patel used it to make it a political one?
Yeah, I mean, speaking to a few people who were commenting on this case, they raised some points about this being about geopolitics, about the sort of the spectacle around it all. One Mexican crime journalist who I spoke to described wedding as the golden boy, the perfect example for the U.S. For U.S. President Donald Trump's administration in their narrative on the fight against drugs and against drug trafficking. So it's definitely something we saw on Friday at the press conference. Kash Patel standing there thanking Donald Trump's administration for their support, for their work on the fight against drugs coming into the States. It's something that we've heard a lot of since Trump came into power. And so I think it's interesting. It's good to consider when we're thinking about how Ryan Wedding fits into this narrative. He's a Canadian former Olympic snowboarder who was living in Mexico, hiding out there, allegedly responsible for trafficking tons and tons of cocaine into Canada through the United States. So it sort of hits all of those points. One of the things that we've heard from law enforcement officials is that Ryan Wedding is a modern day Pablo Escobar or the modern day El Chapo. And it's quite a claim to make, something that we've heard again and again in news reports and in headlines around the world. And so, one of the things that's been raised from sources, from people who have been following the case, is that they believe Wedding's image has been inflated to sort of fit this narrative that the FBI and that the Trump administration is pushing on their fight against drug trafficking. And so, one of the things a Mexican journalist and fixer was telling me is that, according to his sources, people who are directly in the Sinaloa cartel, Ryan Wedding wasn't actually known to any of these people. His name doesn't come up in Mexico. And so while he's being cited by, top U.S. government officials, law enforcement officials, people in Mexico don't really know him, don't really care about him, weren't really paying attention until the most recent press conferences. And so I think that's just interesting to consider when we're looking at, all of the allegations and claims against him. That said, he is also accused of being the largest distributor of cocaine in Canada, and he is publicly linked to multiple murders here in the Toronto area, which is something that I've been following. The Star has been covering for 2 years now. And so is this wedding dangerous? According to allegations, yes. Is he allegedly responsible for running the Canadian arm of this drug trafficking pipeline connected to the cartels? According to authorities, yes. That said, is he the modern day iteration of Pablo Escobar? I don't know. I think that people, that's up for debate. People are debating that. But regardless, the offenses, the allegations against him are quite serious. And so, he's facing a number of charges, and we'll see him in court on Monday, and we'll see what happens after that.
So now that Wedding has been arrested, what comes next? You're in California as we speak. He's set to be arraigned today. What are the exact charges he's facing, and what is his future looking like at this point?
He's facing several different charges on murder, on drug trafficking, on possession of cocaine, and running a criminal enterprise, among others. And so he does face the prospect of life in prison.
If Wedding were to cooperate with law enforcement in this investigation, that would be such a nuanced situation, definitely putting his life at risk for giving up information about his network and the cartels, but also perhaps providing some sense of justice for the countless victims involved. You kind of mentioned off the top there that the fact that he did turn himself in could be some indicator of him being willing to cooperate. Does it seem like he will cooperate now that he's in custody?
I wouldn't want to speculate. It remains to be seen, but it's definitely a possibility. And whether we learn about if he's cooperating, that's unclear. At the end of the day, there's an ongoing prosecution. The investigation continues. And I'd imagine that it'll be a while before he actually goes to trial, if he goes to trial. I know some co-defendants in this case have actually pleaded guilty. Some have even been released on bail. With Wedding, it's different because he's facing such serious offenses, serious charges. So I don't think that that is a possibility in terms of him being released. But will he cooperate? I mean, we don't know, and I wouldn't want to necessarily speculate on that.
There are videos online from the FBI of Wedding, walking off the plane in handcuffs with about a dozen officers and investigators in tow. I mean, just tell me about the gravity of this moment in history. This man who once represented Canada on the world stage, who couldn't be found for like 10 years, whose reward prize was valued at $15 million US, is now in the custody of U.S. law enforcement. I mean, what are you making of this moment as someone that's been covering this story and this man for years?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's the culmination, the end of a massive manhunt of a man who's been on the run for a very long time. The most striking thing to me was just how large, how big Ryan Wedding is. I mean, it's one thing to hear about his size, to interview people who, used to snowboard with him, who knew him as a kid, describing him and what he was like, and that he's always been sort of a tall, large, broad-shouldered guy. But it's another thing to actually see this footage, to see him getting off the plane and towering over the FBI agents around him. I mean, to me, that's what really struck me, and I think probably everybody else. It was quite the image to see.
Yeah. What kind of work do you think we'll be seeing from the FBI and the RCMP at this point? We know this is an international operation with stakes both here in Canada and the U.S., and we know they've been collaborating, on this manhunt for years. How could we see the future of this collaboration shape up, especially, given how sensitive our relationship is with the U.S. at this moment?
That's one of the things I'm really interested to see play out. They mentioned that, yes, we got Ryan Wedding, but it doesn't stop here. The investigation continues. They're still after people who are accused of working with Wedding or the organization, as well as other cartel members or associates.
Can you kind of walk us through some of those incidents involving Canadians, including that Ontario couple who was mistakenly killed allegedly at the order of Ryan Wedding back in 2023?
So Wedding has been publicly linked to multiple murders here in Ontario, and one in Colombia, the murder of a federal witness in the case, Jonathan Achebedo Garcia, who was from Montreal. But it all began sort of where I actually began my story in terms of how I covered this case, and that's back in November 2023. There was a triple shooting in Caledon, just along the Caledon-Brampton border. And that shooting turned out to be a case of mistaken identity where a couple who were visiting their adult kids at their rental home in Caledon were gunned down on a Monday night just as they were getting ready for bed. Their daughter also was shot several times. She was in the hospital unconscious, fighting for her life. And then she came off the ventilator weeks later and actually was able to recount what exactly happened that night. Authorities later revealed that the killings that Wedding allegedly ordered in Caledon were by gunmen that were looking for a different target. They were looking for a trucker who allegedly stole drugs from Ryan Wedding's alleged operation. And so that was the intended target of that shooting. And the gunmen, the people who actually carried out the shooting, still have not been arrested to this day. And so that's just one of the cases that he's been connected to. We also know that Wedding is allegedly responsible for the murder of a 39-year-old man in Brampton just a couple months after the Caledon murders. Wedding's alleged second-in-command, Andrew Clark, another Canadian, is actually accused of ordering the murder of a Niagara Falls man just around the same time, shortly after the Brampton murder. And so him and a local Toronto resident, Malik Cunningham, are accused of killing this man in the driveway of his Niagara Falls home, just steps away from his family. And after that, we learned that Wedding is accused of being responsible for the murder of the FBI's key informant, the man who was set to testify against Wedding and other co-defendants in the case at trial. Wedding's accused of enlisting a number of Canadians, which we've heard about in November. He's accused of enlisting help of several different people to track down and kill this key witness. One of those people that's facing charges and facing extradition to the States is a well-known criminal defense lawyer, Deepak Paradikar. He was actually granted bail just last month in extradition court, and so he is still awaiting a hearing, which could be a while from now. And so he's just one of many Canadians, more than 24 who have been charged in this case. To date, 36 people have been arrested in connection to wedding.
I guess one of the biggest questions remains, what happens to that $15 million US? Given the murkiness of the details of his arrest, what have law enforcement said about who gets that money at this point?
You know what? I'm so glad you asked that, Maria, because that is still a question I have. It was asked at the presser yesterday, and FBI Director Kash Patel declined to say what happened, if anything, to that reward that was being offered. So we actually don't know. Maybe nothing. I mean, I know they issued it, but it doesn't seem like it was necessarily a specific person that turned wedding in, that it was looking to get that reward. So I don't know. We don't know what happened to that money that they offered. So it's just something that, yeah, it's funny. Like, you're reporting on this case, you're hearing of the development, and then you're like, oh wait, what about that $15 million that they mentioned? And so yeah, we don't actually know.
Yeah. Oh. As this case is beginning to unravel, what are you looking for in the coming months as you continue to cover the investigation? And if there is a trial, I'm sure you'll be covering that too. What are you looking for in the months to come?
I'm just curious to see how this trial is going to play out in court. I mean, if it gets to trial, there's that possibility that Wedding pleads guilty. I mean, that would be, I don't know if I want to say surprising, given the charges he's facing. It's going to show that he's being cooperative, if he does decide to plead guilty. But that's something that I'm looking for.
Calvi, as we're, wrapping up this conversation, I mean, you are one of the lead people that really has dug her teeth into this investigation from the beginning. I mean, you've been reporting on this for years now. How has it been like, reporting this case? I mean, this is such a fascinating, multifaceted story and case. What has that been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially taken over my life, as I tell my colleagues and my friends. But no, I mean, it's quite the case, as you say. It's full of moving pieces, several people who are connected to this web. I mean, whether they're facing charges or just their names have been brought up. And so I constantly continue to dig and to look into this. And one of the things that I continue to look into is really the story of Ryan Wedding. We know a lot now about how he went from former Canadian Olympic snowboarder to alleged drug kingpin, but there are still a lot of gaps in that story and the timeline that I have been looking into, and I'm really excited to explore more of that. One of the things I'm really thrilled about is to be sharing some of this reporting and continuing to report with colleagues. So Toronto Stars is actually teaming up with the CBC to do a podcast series about this very case. So that will be on the Stars Suspicion podcast and the CBC's Uncover. And I'm working on this podcast with the host, Michelle Shepard, and an incredible team of producers here at the Star and the CBC. And so I'm really looking forward to digging in and working with them. And that will be released in the fall of 2026 alongside another project, a documentary that I'm part of as well.
All right, Calvi Leon, crime reporter for the Toronto Star. Thank you so much for coming back on to update us on the latest on this. Looking forward to seeing your reporting as the investigation continues.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that was The Big Story. It's quite the interesting one, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or reach us on Blue Sky @thebigstory. If you know someone that might enjoy this episode, be sure to send it to them as well. The Big Story publishes every day, and don't forget our weekend listens. I'm Maria Kestane. Thanks for listening.